Thousands of people protested Western intervention in Ethiopia over the weekend. This is a story we've continued to follow because it's increasingly nuanced, and the narrative that the mainstream media tells us is increasingly confusing. And so we've brought in a guest today. Journalist Hermela Aragawi joins us. Thank you so much for coming, because I'm excited to talk to you, and I'm excited for your perspective, because you are an independent journalist and you are ethnically Ethiopian. So it's a pleasure to have you on our show.
Welcome.
And it's been very refreshing to hear you guys, because a lot of what's on the mainstream media is pretty infuriating.
Well, we heard from a lot of our viewers last week who said, you need to have her on. We need to dive into this topic. So we listen to our audience on big stories like this.
So what I said, I just simplified this crudely. Is it true that the protesters in Ethiopia this week were actually protesting Western intervention and also saying they are pro-Tigray people, but anti-TPFL, which is the group there that is the military group that's facing the government?
Right, the TPLF. Yeah, they are essentially the old guard. They were in power from 1991 to 2018. They were backed by the U.S. to overthrow the then communist government at the time. And then after years of protests where people literally died to get them out of power because they were so brutal in the way that they ruled, and they just completely bankrupted the country by looting a lot of the money that was meant to be for development. So the first thing is, these aren't just a ragtag rebel group that's trying to free their ethnicity. I'm ethnically Tigrayan. Both of my parents are from Tigray. And the majority of that region has remained poor for the large part of the 27 years that they have ruled the entire country. So if they're going to be the Tigray People's Liberation Front, they had 30 years to do it, and actually 17 years before that as rebels. And in about 50 years, that region remains one of the poorest regions in the country. So it's just their name does not live up to what they say they are and what the mainstream media tries to paint them as. And so this weekend was just a culmination of 2 years of frustration. I want to say it was upwards of 1 million, maybe more people between Addis Ababa, the capital, and a few other cities that had massive protests. This mirrored people going out into the streets last November, which was millions of people after we launched the hashtag No More movement. And essentially what that is saying no more to exploitation that uses the tools of disinformation, which then divides the people, which then creates conflict and war. So after about a year of this current conflict, where mainstream media were making these guys the victims and were acting like they were the protectors of ethnic Tigrayans, which make about 5% of the population, most of us got together and decided we have to have a very organized campaign online to push back against this. And you guys might know my story, you might not, but in the beginning, because I wasn't as well versed on the internal Ethiopian politics, and I am from mainstream media, recovering mainstream media journalist, was with CBS Los Angeles for 3 years prior to this. Local news is a little less infuriating, I will say, but international news is just completely off. I mean, CBS News just covered about 12 people outside of a UN meeting that sort of favors insurgents, old guard insurgents. And they cover those 12 people. But last November, there was a 27-30 city protest where there were 25,000 people, roughly, over 20,000 people in DC, thousands in New York, and you could barely find it on mainstream media. So it's so clear that they have a bias in this. And as time goes on, they start to shift because they know the guys that they bet on are potentially losing. But yeah, absolutely. Ethiopians and Eritreans in the larger part of the Horn have decided Western intervention is keeping them oppressed under this group, which had 80% of the armaments, by the way, when they started the war, because they did run the country for 27 years, and they made sure to hoard up all the armament in the Tigray region, which had the largest army base. So I'll stop there because I know it's a lot, but the story has been just flipped on its head.
No, I mean, welcome to the club, a recovering mainstream media journalist. But this is important, and I think because you have such a great voice, you've been able to give voice to such an important story, as complicated as it is. So let's kind of pick a few pieces apart here from a journalist perspective, the who, what, why, where, and how of this. How exactly has the Western governments influenced Ethiopia? What specifically are they doing that most people don't know about?
So one way is making these two sides the same. So you've got an elected government, the first actually closest to the to a democratically elected government that Ethiopia has ever seen. First, we had a feudal system, violently overthrown by a communist system, violently overthrown by this TPLF-led EPRDF system. And so the first thing is they equate these insurgents, which are powerful insurgents. They're not just your run-of-the-mill. They equate them with the Ethiopian government. So that's the first place where they blur the picture. And then they go even further and insinuate that the Ethiopian government, along with the Eritrean government, which is a neighboring country, are trying to ethnically cleanse the north and wipe out all ethnic Tigrayans, because that region is where this group is occupying. So it
yes,
makes
in
this
fact,
group.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but in fact, the New York Times reported in August that the government was firing on kindergartners inside of Tigray. This was something that it seems like Western media is all on board, that it's really the Abiy Ahmed administration that is the bad guy here.
Absolutely. Trash. New York Times trash when it comes to Ethiopia.
Agreed. And a lot of other things.
I don't know how else to say it. Just completely off, completely shameless in the way that they talk about it. That kindergarten that was alleged to be targeted was debunked. The Ethiopian government was targeting military targets. If you just look at the pictures they send, okay, or they put out there, in one case they said there was a drone attack, and they literally put up a guy's arm which had like a little, like just a wound you can get from something super minor, and that was their evidence. This was like one of the TPLF spokespeople. But my take is, if you look at the propaganda for any other part of the world, when it comes to Africa, it's oversimplified. They don't even try that hard, because most people will go, like they're so used to parts of Africa in war or in sort of poverty, but it's just not that story when it comes to Ethiopia at this point. So it's not true that the Ethiopian government targets kindergartens. For what? For what? And the pictures that they show don't even make that allegation credible. But Reuters doesn't care. They went ahead and went out with it. And then they did eventually come back around and correct it and said, I don't know if they said it wasn't a kindergarten, but something along that line. So what here's where I will say there are parts of the Ethiopian government have been culpable, because it's a war, and they've actually arrested 30 people on their side, 30 soldiers for alleged atrocities, right? Because these things happen. There was a UN High Commissioner report that found that all parties to the conflict committed atrocities. The TPLF, or these insurgents, have never admitted to any sort of atrocities that have happened on their side. And there was an audio leak of a general, one of their generals, a known general, who was commanding his soldiers to shoot at these people that were retreating from the battlefront. And we've learned that many of them are child soldiers. They're on camera. They've put out photos themselves saying, like, we're coming in, we're the warriors of the region. Similar to the Ukraine story, by the way, which I try not to handle too much because we're already getting censored. So I handle the Ukraine and Russia story with some gloves, because we've had several people getting taken down from Twitter. That are related to the No More movement. So they're basically painting these insurgents as these warriors, completely just not even able to die. They completely ignore the fact that they use child soldiers and human wave tactics, where they send in the least experienced and the weakest and young and old up front, which they're known to do in previous wars, including the 2000 war with their neighboring Eritrea. And then they save the experienced guys and women last. So the U.S. doesn't speak to this at all. They're they're always just speaking to it in vague terms. And I will say lately what's different is the Ethiopian government has the upper hand, and they've captured and liberated many cities in that region. I even, hesitate to use the word liberated. It's been propagandized, but they've taken back control of certain cities, major cities in that northern region. And the last thing left is the capital of that region. During this time, there are some peace talks that are scheduled in South Africa, because the U.S. has been saying, we need you guys to stop fighting as far as the Ethiopian government goes, because every time the Ethiopian government's making advances, the U.S. wants them to stop. Anytime the TPLF or these insurgents are making advances, they have nothing to say.
Well, the media, just today I was reading a story that said that Ethiopia has aligned with China and Russia in terms of their peace talks, and that Russia had something to do with negotiating the peace talks. So you can see the battle lines is that if we can tack them on to these other people we've already said are bad, then we have support for the narrative that we've got here, which is anti-government for the democratically elected sovereign state of Ethiopia. What does Russia and China have to do with this? Can you explain why they're trying to associate those?
Sure. So if Ethiopia is leaning towards Russia and China as far as geopolitical partnership, the U.S. is 110% to blame. Ethiopia is known for having friendly relations with the U.S. The majority of Ethiopians, even though they suffered under this ethno-fascist group for much of the 27 years, when the transition happened, they did not think the U.S. would still side with that group, although they know they supported them for much of the 27 years. They thought the U.S. would support the transition, would support their move towards democracy, and then over and over again, they've shown where their alliances are. So if the people and the country are moving towards China and Russia, the U.S. is all to blame. And the UN Security Council held a meeting on Friday, and what the U.S. was trying to do is get a resolution to have the Ethiopian government stop its defensive, because they were responding to a third offensive from the insurgents. And now they're getting close to actually potentially finishing the war. So they were trying to get a resolution to make that happen, and China and Russia vetoed it, and therefore there was no resolution. So, even myself as an individual, there was a whole document done by this group, Valid. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. It's supposed to be this digital social media research group, which just looks like a total, State Department hack. But in that report, my name was in there. Several other people who do similar work that I do were in there, and they were trying to connect us to China and Russia somehow, just kind of, connecting things that don't connect. So it's a way for them to not own their responsibilities in all of this, and they're always making it seem like the people are just going to Russia and China for no reason, when in fact they're going to Russia and China because it's a matter of survival at this point, because of the way that the U.S. has really emboldened these insurgents, and it's caused a lot of damage. Hundreds of thousands of people have died in this war.
Yeah, and that's the most important piece of this, the human toll in all of this. Hermela, we'll get you out of here on this question. What do you think will come of the peace talks this week? Are you hopeful?
I'm not hopeful in terms of the old guard insurgents, which, by the way, 9 of them have been escorted out of the Tigray region. They're criminals, but they've been escorted out of the Tigray region on U.S. military planes to go to these talks in South Africa.
Great.
Yes, Reuters has confirmed that. So while they have pushed children into war that will never see their parents again, while by their own admission, although they like to say it's civilians that died, but they said 300,000 civilians died in this genocide. It's a war. And 300,000 people died because they decided to start a war in November 2020 by attacking the largest army base in the country and literally slaughtering defense soldiers. So I do not have a lot of hope in these peace talks. What I do hope, and I think what a lot of Ethiopians and Eritreans and the people in that region are hoping, is that the war will be over in the next couple of days. The capital of Tigray will be under the control of the federal army. And if it is, when they come to the table with these old guard, bunch of just old greedy people that could care less how many people died for them, as long as they can amass their wealth, then when they come to the table, really they're going to be negotiating the terms of their amnesty. We've heard reports that they may go to Canada, and that, I think, may be what helps the people on the ground who've been brainwashed and indoctrinated, and in many cases coerced into believing that this was a genocide against them. When they see this leadership just leave them on U.S. military planes, I think there will be a lot of people that are infuriated on the ground, and a lot of rehabilitation and reconciliation that needs to happen, because this leadership, this occupation of the region with the help of the U.S. rhetoric and just the mainstream media, absolutely criminal, in my opinion. I hope there comes a time where we can actually hold some of these people accountable. It's caused a lot of damage in the north, and so I have more faith in the Ethiopian people and the Ethiopian government, who've made it very clear the people of Tigray are very Ethiopian, and they're responsible for them like any other people in any region in the country.
Well said. Well said.
Well, thank you for giving us this context. We may ask you to come back because
we will.
Yeah, because this is something that we want to continue to understand, and we had sort of reported it along the mainstream media lines until so many of our viewers were like, this is not right, look into this further. And we're absolutely happy to do that. So thank you so much. How can we follow along with your reporting to continue to follow what happens here?
Sure. I'm on all platforms, including YouTube at Hermela TV, pretty active on Twitter as well. And then we've also launched an Africa-centered news website, eoanews.com. So Eyes on Africa News, eoanews.com. So people can go there and check it out. And if you feel inclined, contribute to keep this independent journalism path going. And I really commend you guys for following up on people's responses. And I do not blame you for going down the mainstream media rhetoric. This thing is so sophisticated and complicated, and they've covered a lot of civic institutions as well. So it's really difficult to get the truth, but I think you guys are getting there. So I appreciate that effort.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us. Come back again.
Thanks so much.